The naked bodies writhed in the flickering candlelight as wine and blood mixed on the marble floors of the papal apartments. What should have been the holiest place in Christendom had become a scene of such debauchery that even hardened Roman nobles recoiled in disgust. At the center of it all sat the Vicar of Christ himself, watching the orgy unfold while poison slowly coursed through his veins. This was August 18th, 1503, and Pope Alexander VI was about to become the first pontiff in history to die during a sex party. But how did the successor of St. Peter fall so far from grace? This is the shocking, true story of the most immoral pope in Vatican history, a tale of murder, incest, and corruption that nearly destroyed the Catholic Church. Rodrigo Borgia was born into a world where the Catholic Church was more concerned with temporal power than spiritual salvation. The year was 1431, and the papacy had become a prize to be bought and sold like any other political office. The Borgias were Spanish nobles who had clawed their way to prominence through cunning, brutality, and an absolute lack of moral restraint. When Rodrigo's uncle became Pope Calixtus III in 1455, it opened a path to power that the young man would follow with ruthless determination. From his earliest days in Rome, Rodrigo Borgia displayed an appetite for pleasure that scandalized even the corrupt papal court. He fathered his first illegitimate child while still in his 20s, openly maintaining mistresses and living a life of luxury that would have made ancient Roman emperors blush. But Borgia understood that in Renaissance Italy, scandal was less important than success, and he began building the network of alliances and bribes that would eventually place him on the throne of St. Peter. By 1492, when Pope Innocent VIII died, Rodrigo Borgia had become one of the most powerful cardinals in Rome. He was also one of the wealthiest, having used his church positions to amass a fortune through simony, extortion, and outright theft. When the conclave met to choose a new pope, Borgia arrived with chests full of gold and promises of rich rewards for anyone who would support his candidacy. The election of Pope Alexander VI was the most brazenly corrupt in church history. Borgia literally bought the papacy, distributing bribes to cardinals with the efficiency of a modern political campaign. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza received 4 mule loads of silver for his vote. Others were promised lucrative bishoprics, palaces, and estates. When the votes were counted, Rodrigo Borgia had purchased enough support to become the 214th pope, taking the name Alexander VI. Alexander's reign began with a celebration that set the tone for everything that followed. The papal coronation was less a religious ceremony than a pagan festival, complete with orgies, drinking contests, and public displays of debauchery that shocked even Rome's jaded population. Contemporary chroniclers wrote that the new pope seemed more interested in celebrating his political victory than accepting his spiritual responsibilities. Almost immediately, Alexander began transforming the Vatican into a den of corruption, unlike anything in church history. He appointed his illegitimate children to high church positions, selling bishoprics to the highest bidders and using papal authority to enrich his family. His son, Cesare Borgia, became a cardinal at age 18, despite having no theological training and showing more interest in warfare than worship. But it was Alexander's daughter Lucrezia who would become the symbol of Borgia corruption. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly amoral, Lucrezia served as her father's primary political tool, married off to various nobles to secure alliances, and then divorced when those alliances were no longer useful. Rumors swirled that Alexander's relationship with his daughter went far beyond paternal affection, with contemporary sources alleging an incestuous affair that produced at least one child. The papal apartments became a playground for the Borgia family's darkest appetites. Alexander hosted regular orgies featuring prostitutes, young men, and sometimes his own family members. These gatherings, known as papal banquets, were attended by Rome's elite, who participated not out of desire but out of fear of the Pope's growing power. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of such depravity that Catholic historians spent centuries trying to suppress the evidence. Alexander's corruption wasn't limited to sexual excess. He was also a prolific murderer who used poison as his primary tool of statecraft. The Pope employed a team of professional assassins who eliminated anyone who threatened Borgia interests. Cardinals who opposed him died mysteriously at dinner parties. Rival nobles were found dead in their beds. Even fellow bishops weren't safe from Alexander's wrath if they stood in his way. The most infamous example of Alexander's murderous nature was the death of his own son, the Duke of Gandia, in 1497. When Gandia's body was pulled from the Tiber River, rumors immediately pointed to Cesare Borgia as the killer, acting on his father's orders, or perhaps out of jealousy over Lucrezia's affections. Alexander's grief seemed genuine, but he did nothing to investigate his son's murder, leading many to conclude that the Pope had sanctioned his own child's assassination. As Alexander's reign continued, his appetites grew more extreme and his behavior more scandalous. The papal court became a center of Renaissance hedonism, with the Pope openly living with multiple mistresses while preaching Christian morality to the faithful. He fathered at least 7 illegitimate children during his papacy, acknowledging them publicly and using papal resources to secure their futures. The breaking point came in 1501 with an orgy so notorious that it became known as the Banquet of Chestnuts. Alexander hosted a dinner party in the papal apartments featuring 50 prostitutes who performed sexual acts with guests while the Pope watched and awarded prizes for the most creative performances. Contemporary accounts describe scenes of such depravity that even hardened Roman observers were shocked. The event became a symbol of how far the papacy had fallen under Borgia rule. By 1503, Alexander's enemies were closing in. Italian nobles who had been terrorized by Borgia violence were forming alliances against the Pope. Foreign powers were threatening intervention to remove the corrupt pontiff. Even within the Vatican, cardinals were plotting rebellion against a pope who had made a mockery of everything the Church claimed to represent. It was in this atmosphere of growing opposition that Alexander made his final, fatal mistake. On August 6, 1503, he attended a dinner party at the villa of Cardinal Adriano da Corneto, a man he had been planning to murder and whose wealth he intended to confiscate. But the cardinal had learned of the Pope's plans and prepared his own deadly surprise. The dinner began normally with the usual mix of political conversation and casual debauchery that characterized Borgia's social events. But as the evening progressed and wine flowed freely, both Alexander and Cesare began showing signs of illness. Contemporary accounts of Alexander's final days vary, but all agree that his death was appropriately scandalous for such a corrupt pope. Some sources claim he died in his bed, delirious and calling out for his dead son, Gandia. Others suggest he died during one final orgy, his body discovered among naked courtesans and scattered wine cups in the papal apartments. The most detailed account comes from Johannes Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, who recorded that Alexander died on August 18, 1503, after 12 days of agony. His body, according to Burchard, was so bloated and discolored by poison that it could barely fit in its coffin. The corpse was so grotesque that only a few brave souls were willing to carry it to its burial. Alexander's death sparked celebrations throughout Rome and across Europe. Church bells rang not in mourning, but in joy, as Christians celebrated the end of the most corrupt papacy in history. The Borgia family's power collapsed almost immediately, with Cesare fleeing Rome and Lucrezia retreating to a convent where she would spend her remaining years trying to atone for her family's sins. The Vatican moved quickly to suppress evidence of Alexander's crimes and clean up the mess he had left behind. Papal apartments were purified, compromising documents were destroyed, and a new narrative was constructed that downplayed the worst excesses of the Borgia reign. But the damage to the Church's reputation was enormous and would contribute to the Protestant Reformation that began just 14 years later. Modern historians debate the exact details of Alexander's life and death, with some arguing that contemporary accounts were exaggerated by his enemies. His death, during what appears to have been his final orgy, was a fitting end to the most immoral papacy in church history. The legacy of Pope Alexander VI serves as a permanent reminder of what happens when spiritual authority becomes corrupted by temporal power. The man who claimed to be Christ's representative on earth died as he lived, surrounded by sin, consumed by corruption, and abandoned by the divine grace he had spent his life mocking. The ghosts of the Borgia papacy still haunt the Vatican today, a reminder that even institutions claiming divine authority are vulnerable to human weakness. Alexander VI's story stands as perhaps the ultimate cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power and the importance of moral leadership in religious institutions. In the end, Pope Alexander VI got exactly what he deserved: a death as scandalous and degraded as the life he had lived, ensuring that his name would be remembered not as a holy father, but as history's most immoral pope.